My brother shoved me into the quiet hallway, his face flushed with anger. "Just stay in the corner, Anaya. Don't embarrass me in front of the Pentagon brass." I nodded, playing the meek sister. 10 minutes later, a 4-star Admiral crossed the ballroom, saluted me, and said, "Colonel Turner, we've been waiting." If you looked at the Turner family mantelpiece, you would think I didn't exist. The mahogany shelf in my parents' sprawling Connecticut home was a shrine dedicated entirely to the triumphs of my older brother, Bryce. There was Bryce in his Ivy League graduation gown, holding his diploma like a conquered flag. There was Bryce grinning on the cover of a regional business magazine, celebrated as the youngest vice president of global partnerships at Sentinel Aerospace. And there was Bryce, shaking hands with a local congressman, perfectly manicured and endlessly confident. Somewhere in the back, obscured by a silver debate trophy, was a single, slightly out-of-focus photograph of me in standard issue fatigues. I was 22 at the time, smiling awkwardly before boarding a transport plane. To my parents and to Bryce, that picture represented the entirety of my life. To them, I was Anaya, the quiet underachiever who couldn't cut it in the corporate world and settled for a safe, boring government job. They told their friends I worked in logistics. They imagined me sitting in a windowless room at Fort Meade, stamping requisition forms for boots and rations, safely insulated from the real movers and shakers of the world. I never corrected them. In my line of work, silence isn't just a virtue, it's a matter of national security. The truth was, I wasn't a logistics clerk. I was a 36-year-old colonel in the United States Air Force, attached to a highly classified Joint Intelligence Task Force under the Department of Defense. I had spent the last decade operating in the shadows of global conflicts. I had coordinated tactical strikes in hostile territories, negotiated with warlords whose names would make civilian blood run cold, and sat in heavily guarded skiffs, sensitive compartmented information facilities, briefing the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I didn't push papers. I moved ghosts across the global chessboard. But to Bryce, I was just his frumpy little sister who didn't understand how the real world worked. The friction between us came to a head a month before the annual Global Defense and Security Summit in Washington, D.C. Sentinel Aerospace was making a massive play for Project Aegis, a multi-billion-dollar Department of Defense contract focused on next-generation satellite surveillance. It was the kind of contract that makes or breaks corporate careers, and Bryce was the lead point man. He called me on a Tuesday. I was standing on the tarmac at an undisclosed location, the roar of C-17 engines in the background, when my secure phone buzzed with a patched-through civilian call. "Abby," Bryce's voice boomed through the receiver, dripping with his usual patronizing warmth. "Listen, Sentinel is hosting the keynote gala at the DC Summit next month. Dad and Mom are coming down, and Dad insisted I invite you. I know it's not really your scene, there won't be any motor pool mechanics there, but it would mean a lot to the family." I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Bryce, I'm pretty busy right now. I don't know if I can get the clearance to take leave." He chuckled, a sound that always made my jaw tighten. "Come on, Abby, just ask your shift supervisor or whatever. Tell them your brother is hosting the biggest defense networking event of the decade. It's at the Waldorf Astoria. You can finally see what the defense industry looks like from the top down. Just do me a favor. If you come, try to dress the part. Leave the combat boots at home. This is high-level stuff. We're talking senators, generals, admirals. I need everything to look perfect. Generals and admirals." The irony was thick enough to choke on. The very people Bryce was desperately trying to impress were the same people I briefed every Friday morning. "I'll see what I can do, Brad," I said quietly. "Great. And Abby, please, just try to blend in. I've got a lot riding on this contract, and I can't have you cornering one of my VIPs and talking their ear off about supply chain requisition forms. Just smile, nod, and let me handle the heavy lifting." He hung up before I could reply. I stared at the phone, a slow, wry smile creeping onto my face. Bryce had always been a master of underestimation, but this time, he was entirely out of his depth. He was playing a game of optics, completely unaware of the actual board we were standing on. I didn't just know about Project Aegis, I was the military liaison who had authored the primary operational requirements for it. I was the one who would ultimately recommend to the Pentagon whether Sentinel Aerospace's tech was actually viable in a combat theater. A week later, my commanding officer, Lieutenant General Marcus Vance, let's call him Lieutenant General Robert Hayes, called me into his office. "Colonel Turner," he said, handing me a heavy manila folder. "The Aegis contract. We need a final assessment on Sentinel Aerospace. They're hosting a gala next weekend. I want you there. Observe their leadership. See if they're as competent as their marketing brochures claim." "Sir," I replied, keeping my face perfectly neutral. "My brother is the VP of Global Partnerships at Sentinel. He actually invited me as his +1. General Hayes raised an eyebrow, a rare look of amusement crossing his weathered face. "Is that so? Well then, you shouldn't have any trouble getting a front row seat. Go in civilian attire. Keep a low profile. Let's see how Sentinel operates when they think the Pentagon isn't looking." And just like that, my brother's patronizing family invitation became an official classified deployment. I wasn't going as Anaya, the meek sister. I was going as Colonel Turner, the ghost in the machine. And Bryce had absolutely no idea what was coming. The Waldorf Astoria Grand Ballroom was a masterclass in corporate opulence. Crystal chandeliers, the size of small cars, cast a warm, golden glow over the sea of attendees. The air was thick with the scent of expensive Tom Ford cologne, roasted duck hors d'oeuvres, and the unmistakable, suffocating desperation of defense contractors trying to pry open the government's checkbook. I arrived precisely at 1900 hours, wearing a simple, tailored black evening gown. It was elegant but understated, intentionally chosen to make me practically invisible in a room full of heavily jeweled spouses and men in bespoke Italian tuxedos. I carried a small clutch and wore my hair pinned up. No medals, no rank insignia, no uniform, just Anaya. Bryce spotted me immediately from across the room. He was holding court near the ice sculpture, surrounded by 3 mid-level Sentinel executives and his fiancée, Chloe, who was dripping in enough diamonds to fund a small tactical operation. Bryce wore a midnight blue tuxedo that probably cost more than my first car. He broke away from his group and marched toward me, his eyes quickly scanning my outfit. A brief look of relief washed over his face. "Abby, you made it," he said, offering a stiff, obligatory hug. "And you look decent. Good. Thank you for not wearing that awful tweed jacket you usually wear to Thanksgiving." "Hello, Bryce. The venue is beautiful," I said politely, slipping effortlessly into the persona of the awestruck little sister. "It should be," he said, adjusting his cuffs. Sentinel spared no expense. Every major player in the DoD procurement pipeline is here tonight. If I play my cards right, the Aegis contract is ours by Monday. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Which is why I need you to be on your best behavior. Dad and Mom are stuck in traffic, so you're flying solo for now. Get a drink, stand near the jazz band, and just lay low." Before I could answer, Chloe floated over, holding a flute of champagne. She looked me up and down, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her perfectly contoured eyes. "Anaya, so glad you could get time off from the warehouse, was it? Logistics?" I corrected gently. "Right. Logistics," Chloe chuckled lightly, resting a hand on Bryce's arm. "Brad has been so stressed about tonight. He's about to meet with Admiral James Holmes. The Admiral Holmes, head of naval intelligence and the chief architect behind the DoD's Space Defense Initiative." I knew exactly who Admiral Holmes was. Jim and I had shared a miserable, freezing helicopter ride out of Kabul 4 years ago. He was a brilliant, no-nonsense commander who despised corporate groveling more than anything else on Earth. If Bryce thought he could win Holmes over with expensive champagne and rehearsed corporate jargon, he was walking into a massacre. "Admiral Holmes is a tough crowd," I noted casually. "He prefers straight talk over sales pitches." Bryce rolled his eyes, a condescending smirk on his face. "Thanks for the tip, Abby. I'm sure your vast experience filing requisition forms for staplers gives you deep insight into the mind of a 4-star admiral. I'll take it from here." For the next hour, I did exactly as instructed. I stood near the jazz quartet, sipping sparkling water and observing. I watched Bryce glide through the room, shaking hands, laughing too loudly at unfunny jokes, and making promises about Sentinel's satellite capabilities that I knew, from reading the classified engineering reports, were dangerously exaggerated. Sentinel's tracking latency was off by a critical 1.2 seconds, a margin of error that could cost lives in a real-time combat scenario. That was exactly why General Hayes had sent me. We needed to know if Sentinel was going to be honest about their system's flaws, or if they were going to try and sweep them under the rug for a multi-billion-dollar payday. Around 8 o'clock, the atmosphere in the room suddenly shifted, the ambient chatter dipped, and a ripple of nervous energy swept through the crowd near the main entrance. Admiral James Holmes had arrived. He moved through the ballroom with the heavy, undeniable gravity of a seasoned combat veteran. He was flanked by two stern-faced aides, his dress uniform immaculate, rows of ribbons gleaming on his chest. He wasn't smiling. He looked like a man who would rather be chewing glass than attending a corporate gala. Bryce's eyes lit up like a predator spotting prey. This was his moment. He grabbed my elbow, his grip surprisingly tight, and pulled me behind him as he maneuvered through the crowd toward the Admiral's path. "Stay behind me," Bryce hissed over his shoulder. "If he asks, 'You're my assistant. Do not speak unless spoken to.'" We intercepted the Admiral's entourage near the center of the room. Bryce stepped directly into Holmes's path, flashing his most winning, blinding smile. "Admiral Holmes, Bryce Turner, VP of Global Partnerships at Sentinel Aerospace. It is an absolute honor, sir. We've been so looking forward to discussing Project Aegis with you tonight." Admiral Holmes stopped. He looked at Bryce the way one might look at a stain on a new pair of boots. He didn't extend his hand. The silence stretched for a brutal, agonizing 3 seconds. Bryce's smile began to falter, the corporate armor cracking just a fraction. "Mr. Turner," Holmes said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried over the soft jazz music. "I'm not here to discuss contracts over cocktails. I'm here to meet with my chief analyst." Bryce blinked, clearly thrown off script. "Your chief analyst, sir? Well, Sentinel has several of our lead engineers here tonight. I'd be happy to." "I don't care about your engineers, Turner," Holmes interrupted, his tone cold enough to freeze water. He looked past Bryce's shoulder, his piercing gray eyes scanning the area. Realizing that I was standing right behind him, directly in the Admiral's line of sight, Bryce panicked. He thought my presence was offending the 4-star officer. With a sharp, sudden movement, Bryce shoved me roughly by the shoulder, pushing me sideways into the quiet, shadowed alcove of the hallway leading to the kitchens. His face was flushed with embarrassment and anger. He leaned into the alcove, hissing at me, completely ignoring the fact that the Admiral was standing just a few feet away. "Just stay in the corner, Anaya," Bryce whispered furiously, his mask slipping entirely. "I told you to lay low. Don't embarrass me in front of the Pentagon brass. Stay out of sight." I didn't argue, I just nodded, playing the meek sister one last time. I stood in the shadows of the alcove, smoothing out my black dress, waiting. Bryce immediately pivoted back to the Admiral, plastering the fake smile back on his face, as if nothing had happened. "My apologies, Admiral. Just dealing with some minor staff issues." Now, regarding the satellite latency we mentioned in our brief. "Quiet," Admiral Holmes snapped. Bryce's mouth snapped shut. The surrounding executives froze. Chloe, standing a few feet away, looked like she might faint. Admiral Holmes completely ignored Bryce. He stepped around my frozen, terrified brother and walked directly toward the shadowed alcove where I had been banished. He stopped 2 feet in front of me, squared his shoulders, and did something that made the entire ballroom gasp in collective shock. The 4-star Admiral snapped into a crisp, flawless salute. "Colonel Turner," Admiral Holmes said, his voice ringing out with profound respect, completely shattering the silence of the room. "We've been waiting for you." Somewhere in the sprawling, gilded ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria, a crystal champagne flute slipped from a trembling hand and shattered against the marble floor. In the deafening silence that had descended over our corner of the gala, the sound of breaking glass echoed like a gunshot. I stepped slowly out of the shadowed alcove. I didn't cower. I didn't slouch. The meek, compliant posture I had worn all evening evaporated, replaced instantly by the rigid, squared shoulder bearing drilled into me over 14 years of military service. Though I wore a black evening gown instead of my dress blues, the invisible weight of the eagle on my collar was suddenly palpable. I met the four-star officer's gaze, offering a single, crisp nod of deep professional acknowledgement. "Good evening, Admiral Holmes. It's a pleasure to see you stateside." "And you, Colonel," Holmes replied, dropping his salute and extending a weathered hand. I shook it firmly. "General Hayes told me you'd be operating embedded tonight. I should have known you'd find a way to blend into the wallpaper." "Invisibility is a tactical advantage, sir," I replied smoothly, my voice projecting with a quiet, steely authority that I had never once used in my parents' house. To my left, Bryce looked as though he had just been struck by lightning. His mouth opened, closed, and opened again. The ruddy, confident flush in his cheeks had drained entirely, leaving him the color of old parchment. He stared at me, then at the Admiral, then back at me, his brain violently rejecting the reality unfolding in front of him. "Admiral," Bryce finally stammered, his voice cracking, completely devoid of its polished corporate baritone. "Sir, I think there is a profound misunderstanding here. This is Anaya. She's my little sister. She works in a warehouse. She files requisition forms for boots." Admiral Holmes slowly turned his head to look at Bryce. The expression on the veteran's face was one of pure, unadulterated disgust. "A warehouse?" Holmes repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly register. He looked back at me, a dark amusement flashing in his eyes. "Is that what you tell them, Colonel?" "Loose lips sink ships, Admiral," I said mildly, keeping my eyes locked on the Sentinel Aerospace executives who were now sweating profusely behind my brother. "Mr. Turner," Holmes said, turning his full, terrifying attention back to Bryce, "your sister does not file requisition forms. Colonel Anaya Turner is the Department of Defense's lead tactical architect for satellite intelligence. She spent the last 36 months coordinating encrypted surveillance networks across 3 hostile continents. She is the principal author of the Project Aegis operational parameters. If she tells me your company's orbital array is a liability, I will personally pull your funding before you finish your morning coffee. So, if you ever lay a hand on my lead analyst and shove her into a corner again, I will have the military police escort you out of this building in zip ties. Do we understand each other?" The silence that followed was absolute. Chloe, Bryce's diamond-draped fiancée, visibly took a step away from him. The 3 mid-level Sentinel executives looked like they wanted the floor to open up and swallow them whole. Bryce's pride, the central pillar of his entire existence, crumbled in real time. "Yes, sir. I apologize, sir," he whispered, looking at the floor. "Don't apologize to me," Holmes snapped. Bryce swallowed hard. He slowly turned his head to face me. The patronizing smirk he had worn since childhood was gone, replaced by a terrified, fragile realization that the sister he had patronized his entire life was holding a guillotine rope over his multi-billion-dollar career. "Abby, Colonel, I didn't know." "I know you didn't, Bryce," I said, my voice calm but entirely devoid of sisterly warmth. I turned my attention past him, locking eyes with David Arris, Sentinel's sweating chief of engineering, who was hiding behind the executives. "Mr. Arris," I called out. The engineer jumped. "Yes, ma'am? Colonel?" "Let's skip the marketing brochures and the jazz music," I said, stepping fully into the light of the chandelier. I didn't raise my voice, but the command in my tone anchored every eye in the room to me. "I've read your localized telemetry reports. I read the raw data, not the sanitized summary your executives sent to the Pentagon. Your tracking latency on the low orbit array is lagging by 1.2 seconds during solar interference. In a coordinated theater, a 1.2-second delay means my ground teams get hit by artillery before your system even registers the launch. You tried to bury that metric on page 400 of your secondary diagnostic file." David Arris turned ghost white. Bryce whipped his head around to stare at his engineer, completely blindsided. "David, is that true?" Bryce demanded, his panic spiking. "You told me the array was flawless." We were going to patch it in phase 2, Brad," David stammered, wiping his brow. "It's a hardware limitation, we thought." You thought the Department of Defense wouldn't notice, I interrupted, cutting him off like a scalpel. You thought you could wine and dine Admiral Holmes, secure a $3 billion contract, and fix the fatal flaw on the taxpayer's dime while my soldiers sat in the crosshairs. I stepped closer to Bryce, who shrank back slightly. This isn't a country club debate tournament, Brad. This isn't a corporate merger. This is national security. When you lie about your capabilities, people in my unit don't lose their bonuses. They come home in flag-draped coffins. I turned back to Admiral Holmes, who was watching the slaughter with a grim nod of approval. Sir, in my professional assessment, Sentinel Aerospace lacks the operational transparency required for Project Aegis. The color drained completely from Bryce's face. He swayed slightly, realizing that I had just single-handedly killed the biggest deal of his life. Understood, Colonel, Holmes said, turning on his heel. My office, Monday at 0800. We'll discuss reopening the bidding process to your secondary recommendations. Good evening. As the Admiral and his entourage swept out of the ballroom, the corporate illusion shattered. The executives instantly descended upon David Arris in a furious, panicked whisper. Chloe was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, and Bryce just stood there, entirely hollowed out, staring at the little sister he had never bothered to know. 30 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open, and my parents walked in. My mother, wearing a silver evening gown, and my father, in a sharp tuxedo, looked flustered from the DC traffic. They immediately scanned the room, looking for the familiar, triumphant face of their golden boy. Instead, their eyes landed on a bizarre tableau near the VIP lounge. I was seated in a high-backed leather armchair, a glass of water in my hand. Surrounding me were 3 two-star generals, the Undersecretary of Defense, and the CEO of Sentinel Aerospace, who had rushed down from his penthouse suite the moment he heard what had happened. They were all leaning in, hanging on my every word as I quietly explained the architectural requirements for the Pentagon's intelligence network. Standing a few feet away, holding a discarded napkin and looking entirely lost, was Bryce. Anaya, my father said loudly. Cutting through the murmurs of the brass, he marched over, my mother in tow, looking deeply confused. What on earth are you doing? Where is your brother? You shouldn't be bothering these gentlemen. The CEO of Sentinel Aerospace, a ruthless billionaire named Richard Covington, turned to my father with a scowl. Bothering us? Are you joking? Colonel Turner is doing us a profound favor by even remaining in this building. My father stopped dead in his tracks. Colonel? I excused myself from the circle of officials and walked over to my parents. I didn't offer the awkward, apologetic smile I usually gave them when they scolded me. I stood tall, meeting my father's eyes squarely. Dad, Mom, I said smoothly, welcome to the summit. Anaya, what is going on? My mother hissed, looking frantically between me, the military brass, and Bryce, who was currently staring at a potted plant as if it held the secrets to the universe. Why are they calling you Colonel? You work in logistics. You're a clerk. I let you believe that, Mom, because my actual clearance level doesn't allow me to discuss my deployments at the Thanksgiving dinner table, I said quietly. I am a colonel in the United States Air Force. I direct global intelligence operations. And tonight, I am the lead Pentagon assessor for the contract your son has been trying to sell. My father looked at Bryce for confirmation. Bryce slowly nodded, looking utterly defeated. It's true, Dad. She runs the whole show. And she just pulled our contract. You pulled his contract? My father turned on me, his protective instincts for his son flaring up. Anaya, how could you do that to your own brother? He has worked for years for this. Your family. I didn't pull it because he's my brother, Dad. I pulled it because his engineering team lied about a fatal system latency, I said, my voice hardening, echoing the cold authority I used in war rooms. My loyalty is to the men and women who rely on this technology to survive combat. Bryce chose to prioritize his quarterly bonus over their lives. Family or not, I will not sign off on a compromised system. My father opened his mouth to argue, but he looked into my eyes and suddenly stopped. For the first time in 36 years, he didn't see a disappointing daughter. He saw a commanding officer. The sheer force of the reality checked him, and he slowly stepped back, realizing he had absolutely no power in this dynamic. I walked over to Bryce. He flinched slightly as I approached. "Why didn't you just tell us?" Bryce asked, his voice thick with resentment and humiliation. "All these years, you let us think you were a nobody. You let me treat you like you were beneath me. Was it a game to you? Did you just want to humiliate me?" I looked at him, feeling a strange mix of pity and profound exhaustion. "No, Brad, I didn't tell you because you never asked. You never once showed a genuine interest in my life. You just looked at my uniform, made an assumption that fit your worldview, and you ran with it because it made you feel taller to have a failure for a sister." He looked away, the truth of the statement hitting him harder than Admiral Holmes' reprimand. "I'm going to offer Sentinel one final lifeline," I said quietly, ensuring only he could hear me. Bryce's head snapped up, a desperate glimmer of hope in his eyes. "I am recommending that Project Aegis be split into a joint venture," I continued. "Sentinel will partner with Apex Dynamics. Apex will handle the software architecture to fix your latency, and Sentinel will provide the orbital hardware. You keep the contract, but your profits are cut in half, and your personal bonus for this quarter is 0. Bryce swallowed hard. "Half is better than nothing. I can sell that to the board. There's a catch," I added, leaning in slightly. "For the next 2 years of development, Sentinel must report directly to the Pentagon's Oversight Committee for weekly progress reviews to ensure strict compliance and absolute transparency." "Okay," Bryce nodded quickly. "We can do that. Who heads the committee?" I offered him a very small, very cold smile. "I do." The realization washed over him. For the next 2 years, the golden boy of Sentinel Aerospace was going to have to report, salute, and answer directly to his little sister. The corporate hierarchy had been entirely inverted. "I expect your first progress report on my desk by 0800 on Monday, Mr. Turner," I said, my tone strictly professional. "Do not be late. And Brad?" He looked at me, thoroughly humbled. "Yes, Colonel?" "Next time we go to an event together," I said, adjusting the strap of my evening clutch, "don't ever shove me into a corner." I didn't wait for a reply. I turned my back on my stunned family, walked past the silent executives, and exited the grand ballroom, stepping out into the cool Washington, D.C. night. The gala continued behind me, but the rules of engagement had forever changed. I was no longer the ghost on the mantelpiece. I was the architect of the board, and they finally knew exactly who was playing the game. Sometimes the people we underestimate the most are the ones holding the keys to our future. If you loved this story about family dynamics, hidden strengths, and standing your ground, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs a reminder never to judge a book by its cover. Subscribe to the channel for more incredible true-to-life dramas, and let me know in the comments, how would you have handled a brother like Bryce? See you next time.